Okay, so in this tutorial I'm going to cover how to complete the workshop deliverable for the laser portion, for the laser workshop that asks for a rendering. So in the document workshop deliverables, down here it asks for a rendering using the materials generated from the photographs of the samples. So I'm going to quickly cover how to kind of prepare the photos and set up your rendering. So I'll start by working from the photo here. So I used a photograph that was taken from my from a sample, from a cast. So you will all want to use the kind of photographs that you take from your own prototypes, and make sure that you kind of take a large swatch. So you probably want a larger swatch than this. My sample was very small. And you also want to make sure that you have even lighting on the surface, so that you don't have like shadow or anything like that kind of coming across the surface. So take it with the surface facing towards the light source and make sure you're not casting any shadow on it. So what I'll do first is I'm going to set up my file, and you'll want to render just using your shape that you modeled for the prototyping process. And I'm going to work from the digital handbook. So if you go to caplo.arizona.edu and under search for the software guidebook, go to student software, and down here under School of Architecture software guidebook, click on that link, and this PDF tutorial walks you through a whole bunch of different kind of workflow issues with software. But the one we're going to look at today is under Rhino Render V-Ray. I'm going to go ahead and click on that one. It should take me straight to that section. And this tutorial will just kind of guide me through the general setup. So first I want to make sure I have V-Ray set as my rendering software. Just under Render, Current Render V-Ray. Then I want to go ahead and set up my view, so I'll make sure I'm in perspective. I can change the change the perspective angle by just typing in perspective angle, so you can make a little wider camera lens angle. And then when I'm done with that, I also want to save my view angle, so I could open up the panel named views, and I'm just going to go ahead and save this view so I can get back to it easily. Okay. Then I want to go ahead and set up my render settings. So I go under V-Ray, Asset Editor, and first thing I'm going to go to the gear, little gear icon. I'm going to set up my render output. So under output, I'm going to go to aspect ratio, change that to match viewport. I'm also going to turn on the safe frame so I can kind of see where my camera proportions are. And then when once I've set it up to my viewport proportions, I could change it back to custom, and I could take my resolution up. About 2500 width is good for 11 by 17. Okay, and then the next step would be to set up my lighting. So again, I'm going to use the V-Ray Sun. I'll go to V-Ray, V-Ray Lights, Sunlight. You can leave it on, you can turn off manual control and set it to a specific location. Right now I'm going to leave it on manual control, and I'm just going to kind of set it up to something that I think will work for my view. You generally want the light source facing kind of towards your object from where you're looking, but not like directly in line with your object. And I should point out, you can also adjust the sun angle by just moving this arrow in your viewport. If that's my sun angle, I'll have some sunlight kind of casting across. Okay, and then I should also point out in the asset editor, under lights, I can turn on and off the different sunlight or different light sources. I want to make sure I only have one sun at all times, and I'm just working by adjusting that one sun. Then the next step would be to set up the environment. So I've set up the direct light source, which is my sunlight. I'll go under environment, under background first. I want to click on this little checkerboard icon, right click, and click clear. And I'll click on it again and click bitmap. Under bitmap, I can go to, or I'm sorry, no, don't click bitmap, go back, go clear it. So click on the gray. Once it's gray, click on it and go to sky. And under sun, you want to set it to the sunlight. That's the light source that we just created, the V-ray sun. And I also in here, I want to make sure under environment overrides that I have the skylight on, reflection and refraction turned on. So the skylight will be the secondary lighting. And because we're using a sky to reference our sun angle, it should kind of match, the atmospheric lighting should kind of match the angle of the sun. I'm just going to drag this little checkerboard to all three. And then reflection and refraction are just going to make it so that our materials reflect the sky rather than a black background. Okay, once I have the environment set up, I can also create a ground plane. I'm just going to model a big flat plane for that. So I'll switch onto another layer, use the command plane. And I don't need to apply, I just want to make sure it's kind of big enough that it won't interrupt our view. And then I want to set the materials up. So this part, I'll go back over on the very left in the asset editor to the circle with the checkerboard. And I'm going to make my own materials for this. So I'll go to bottom left, click add material. I'll just choose generic for right now. And then if I click on the little arrow in the right-hand side of the window right there, you can see I can load all the options I have for setting up my material. And the first option I have is what's called the diffuse, which means either the color, you can see that color, but I can also set this to a map rather than a color. And that's what I'm going to use my texture for. So first I would save this, file, save it as a JPEG, and I would save that as my diffuse channel. So save it as a JPEG, and then in here I can go click on the checkerboard. This time I'll choose bitmap, and I can go to where I saved my files. And I'll click on the one that I've used for my, just the color. Okay, and you should see, once you click OK, I should see that texture become applied to the sample here. Then I want to set up reflection. So I'm going to expand the tab for reflection under reflection color. This slider basically just affects like how reflective our object is. So completely white is completely reflective or kind of polished looking. Black is no reflection, and then reflection glossiness will affect the sharpness of our reflection. So I'm also going to use a map for this to kind of make it look more realistic. So under reflection color, I want to set that all the way over to the right, completely white. And under glossiness, I'm going to use a bitmap. Before I do that, I'm going to go back to Photoshop, and I'm going to show you how to kind of adjust this image to use it as a reflection map. The first thing will be to make a layer, just ignore those for right now, make a layer called black and white. In the layers panel at the bottom, the little circle with the black and white, I'll choose the one, and that should translate my image into black and white, so no color. I'll explain why in a minute. And then I'm going to try to kind of adjust the contrast and brightness. So I will choose exposure next. And under here, I want to kind of crank it up a little bit. I can turn down the offset a little bit to get a little more contrast. But I generally just want to make it kind of lighter. Something like that. Not too light, but lighter. Okay, then I would go to File, Save As, change it to JPEG, and then rename it. So this needs to be a separate file. So rename it as Reflection or something like that, and click Save. Okay, so now I can go into my reflection under reflection glossiness, click on the checkerboard and choose bitmap, and then I'll choose the one that I renamed as reflection. Okay, and so the way this works is actually the same as reflection color. It just uses kind of black and white or grayscale images to determine how reflective our surface looks. Let me see if I can expand this a little bit more. If you can kind of see, it's hard to tell in here, but the surface will kind of reflect more in the areas that are lighter on our map, and then less in the areas that are darker, which will kind of make it appear more three-dimensional, which is obviously that's the way the surface texture actually is. Okay, so our next step would be to set up what is called a bump map. So under maps, I'll go to bump, normal mapping. I'm going to click that slider. Okay, and then here I'm also going to use a map. I go to Photoshop. I'm going to uncheck this exposure. And this time I'm going to make a new adjustment called levels. And so for this, the principle is the same. We want a black and white or grayscale image. In this case, I really want the kind of deep spots to be dark, and I want the flush or the outside surface to be kind of all one color, which is why I'm using levels. If I slide it over from the right, slide this down, I want the deep kind of cracks to be really dark, and I want the outside surface to be as light or as white as possible. So something like that. That looks not too bad. Okay, so like I said, the principle is the same, except that the way that the bump map works, and I'll just say this is a JPEG, rename it, and hit save. And the way that the bump map works is it looks at where the image is black and where the image is white, and it kind of simulates like a three-dimensional surface. So if I'm going to load that image into my bump map, and you can see now, again, it's kind of hard to tell, but it'll actually make our surface appear like physically three-dimensional when we render it. Now the other thing I want to do before I'm done is go over here to where it says amount and slide that slider way down to like 0.05 or something, because 1 is actually massive. Okay, and then I could also rename my material. This is just, I'll just rename it whatever. Okay. And now I'm done setting up this material. I'm going to go to the layer that I have my model on, which is the layer default. I'm going to click on in the layers panel under the column material, click on the little circle, and then use plugin V-Ray, click browse, and select that material I just set up, and click OK. Now if I change my viewport into rendered, I can also kind of preview how the texture mapping will work. So if I select my object, go to properties, go to texture mapping, I'm actually going to clear it. Okay, so it should look something like that. So it's kind of mapping it by like stretching your texture across the whole thing. But we can make it look a little more consistent, especially in the case of like, rammed earth or like kind of layered material. We're actually just going to use the option to apply box mapping. So select your whole object, go to properties, go to texture mapping right here, and click apply box mapping. So I can click in the viewport now and kind of draw a box. I'm going to draw mine kind of shallow because of the shape of my texture image, but you'll want yours to be in the proportion of your image. So if you have an image that's kind of taller than it is wide, you would want a really tall box. If you have an image that's wider, you would want a narrow, flat box, or a shallow box, I mean. Okay, and then when you're done, it'll ask if you want it capped. The answer is yes. Press enter. Okay, and now you can see it's kind of using that JPEG to kind of give us this layered material. So now we're ready to do a sample render. So I would go to V-Ray Asset Editor, go back to the gear icon, and under renderer, I can choose interactive. I want to do kind of a quick study. And as long as my image is set to interactive, then I can go to camera, or I'm sorry, my render is set to interactive, and I can move the slider, and I can kind of adjust my camera exposure on the fly, see what the results are. That looks pretty good. And I could also adjust my sun, I believe. We need to change back into shaded. I can move my sun around, kind of make sure my lighting looks okay. So again, you want the light to kind of be coming across the surface you're looking at. You don't kind of lose the three-dimensionality of the shape. Okay, a little brighter. All right, that looks pretty good. So when you're happy with your test render, just hit stop. Go back to the asset editor, and then uncheck interactive and uncheck progressive. And then the slider over here under quality will allow you to set the kind of level of quality of your rendering. So if we do a really fast one, and we can kind of zoom in and see that kind of texture is coming out. And it should look pretty good. Okay. And that should conclude this tutorial.